Bobby and I started working in his second year on this paper that looks at the effect of occupational licensing on gender and racial wage gaps. And we find something really surprising, which is that in the presence of occupational licensing, that racial wage gaps are reduced and also gender wage gaps are reduced. So I want to introduce you to my student, Bobby Chung, who's a senior student in my research group, and he's also a junior Price Theory Fellow here at the University of Chicago. Bobby,
Hi.
Really proud of you.
Good morning. Yeah.
So I would like for you to just share with the viewing audience what your experience has been working on this project. What have been some of the things that you've learned about yourself as an economist and how you take that into your future?
So just thinking about the first time that I meet you and suggest the idea that occupational licensing could have differential effects on different groups of people. This is kind of a preliminary idea, and I remember that I write you some proposal and you return to me and they say write it again, write it twice, write it third time, and the fourth time and say, yeah, okay, that's a brilliant idea, and we work on it. So starting from that, I learned how to formulate the idea in an organized way, and also handle the data very well. Yeah, and I hope to bring these skills to also build on my job market paper too.
Yeah, and it's just been incredible just to see just the level of energy that you bring to the project and the level of discipline, because in a lot of ways you've been responsible for me recognizing that I can replicate this with even more students. And I want you to talk a bit about your job market paper too, because it's a very exciting paper that's going to be hitting the market in a year. So tell us a bit more about your job market
So
paper.
actually my research is looking at racial inequality. So I have one paper with Peter is about occupational licensing. So this is the factors in the labor market, what happens in the labor market. But what my main thesis about is the factors before we enter the labor market, which is what happened in the school. So my topic is how does racial peer effects affect long-term outcome, especially college enrollment. And the main thing here is that I want to explore the mechanisms behind, because we always think of like the average quality of your peers matter, but there are actually other alternatives that can affect our performance, such as relative performance, such as whether the best of your peer affect you or whether the worst of your peer affect you. So I have the preliminary result is that for same race influences for both white and blacks, both relative performance and average characteristics matter. But I cannot reject the null hypothesis that there's no effects for interracial interaction. So it is kind of counterintuitive that if we put people together, we think that they will interact with each other, benefit with each other. But what I preliminarily find out is that only same race influence are significant.
Yeah, and these are really, this has really profound implications for how we think about organizing classrooms, right? In terms of like, how do you, for example, in a lot of classes, there's tracking. And so to what extent does that matter? And does that matter differentially by race? And so one of the key features of a lot of the work that we do in the research lab is like really trying to think very deeply about questions of race and racial inequality, whether it's in the labor market, whether it's in an educational context, and trying to bring the lens of economics to ask some of these questions. And that's one of the things that's very exciting for us. I always remember when we had the moment where Bobby came in with the results, and we were finding this really huge positive effect of licensing on the wages of black men. And initially Bobby said, "Professor, I think that something is wrong." And I said, "No, Bobby, if you ran the regressions right, if the data is cleaned properly, this is the result. We have to ask ourselves the question, what is it about African American men that a license could be signaling?" And one of the things that came to mind was, well, there are differential rates of arrest for felonies. And so it could be that. At this time, we had no idea that licensing precluded felons from having an occupational license in some states. And so we went to the data and we started to look. And we saw that In fact, there are over 16,000 citations in the US for different states and occupation pairs where felons are restricted from participating in those occupations. And so we invested a lot of time in trying to collect this data and to cull it and to organize it. And Bobby was really the driving force behind this data collection. Like, he must have learned like 3 different statistical packages and scraping packages to do this. And after we put all of this data together, he ran the regressions, and we saw indeed it was primarily coming through this felony channel. So black men who work in licensed occupations that don't have a felony restriction, they get the same licensing premium as white men, which is pretty small. It's around about 2 or 3%. But black men who work in occupations that preclude felons, they get a differential premium of around about 14%. To put that in context, that's like the equivalent of an additional 2 years of schooling, right? Just being able to signal that you don't have a felony. And so this was quite a startling result for us. And so we tried to beat upon this in a lot of ways. We tried to say, well, maybe it's the case that in states that have licenses with felony restrictions, people tend to be more unionized, or they tend to work more for the government, both of which are correlated with higher wages. Or it could be that there's just a different disparity in the arrest in these states, which is why these licenses existed in the first place. And so we tried to account for all of these different possible explanations, and still this 14% was incredibly stubborn. And even going beyond that, we started to think, well, perhaps how would we deal with measurement error in the data? And so we did a policy where we randomized whether somebody had a license or not, to see if we just came up with a random distribution of licenses, could we replicate our findings? And we couldn't replicate it with this random distribution of data. And so this really convinced us that something is here, and that indeed the license is a positive signal for non-felony status. And right now there's a lot of discussion about deregulation of licensing. There's also a lot of discussion about ban the box. And so Jennifer Duliak, Amanda Egan, they have some really beautiful papers that look at what happens when you limit the ability of employers to know whether an employee has a felony or not. And they have this really counterintuitive result, which is that you actually see that it's less likely that black men will get callbacks for resumes. Now, naively, you might think, well, this is a labor market barrier for African American men. If we remove this, this is going to improve the employment probability for black men. But in fact, it turns out that this information about felony status is incredibly important, and particularly important for black men. So removing this information from the labor market actually results in worse outcomes for black men. And what we do is we look at the flip side of that, which is what happens when you provide this information. What happens to the wages of black men? What happens to that? And what we find is that the wages of black men go up, right? And it makes sense, because if we're providing firms with better information about the quality of black men and about their experience in their experiences, then firms are able to make better decisions and incorporate that information into the prices. One thing that we really highlight a lot in the paper too is that in the absence of this information, you can have a situation in which not only do black men earn lower wages, because now you have felons and non-felons pooling together, but you can also have an effect in which the riskiness of hiring a black man can actually go up. And so you can have firms substituting away from hiring black men in the absence of this information. And so the headline from our paper really is that we're not saying that licensing is good. We're saying that licensing provides information to the labor market. And we know from the work of great economists like Eugene Fama and Michael Spence that labor markets and markets in general require information in order to transact efficiently. And that's what we're showing in our paper.